In the first part of the prepare step, we looked at organizational level risk assessment. In this task, we'll look at system level risk assessment and how that ties in to the earlier organizational risk assessment and how to conduct a risk assessment on your system. So join us for more. In this video, we'll be talking about task P14, risk assessment at the system level. Conduct a system level risk assessment and update the risk assessment results on an ongoing basis. That is the requirements of task P14. Potential inputs to this task are assets to be protected, mission, business functions, and mission business processes the system will support, mission, business analysis or critical analysis, system stakeholder information, information about other systems that will interact with the system, provider information, threat information, data map, system design documentation, cybersecurity framework profiles, risk management strategy, and the organization level risk assessment results from the risk assessment that was conducted earlier in the prepare step. These inputs can all drive this task being completed successfully. Expected outputs from this task are the security and privacy risk assessment report. A lot of information to cover in this topic, so let's jump into it. Primary responsibility for this task is the system owner, the system security officer, the system privacy officer, supported by the senior accountable official for risk management or the risk executive function, the authorizing official or authorizing official's designated representative, the mission or business owner, the information owner or information steward, and of course the security control assessor. This aligns to the SDLC for a new system in the initiation step, concept requirements definition, and for existing systems in operations and maintenance. It aligns to the cybersecurity framework for ID.RA or risk assessment. The organization understands the cybersecurity risk to organizational operations, including mission, functions, image or reputation, organizational assets and individuals, as well as ID.SC to supply chain risk management. Suppliers and third-party partners of information systems, components, and services are identified, prioritized, and assessed using a cyber supply chain risk management process. This task requires that organizations conduct security and privacy risk assessments to ensure that each type of risk is fully assessed. Assessments of security risk include identification of threat sources and threat events affecting assets, whether and how the assets are vulnerable to the threats, the likelihood that an asset vulnerability will be exploited by a threat, and the impact or consequence of loss of assets. So this is where we look at those things, that basic risk principle where we talk about a vulnerability plus a threat equals a risk. We're expanding that a little bit, and we're talking about the vulnerabilities to the threats, how that exploitation can happen, and what would be the impact or consequence if that risk was realized. The impact of asset loss is important. As a key part of risk assessment, assets are prioritized based on the adverse impact or consequence of asset loss. The meaning of loss is defined for each type of asset to enable a determination of the consequence of loss or the adverse impact of loss. So we have to look at each type of asset, whether it's tangible or non-tangible, and what is the impact of that loss. Is it purely a monetary loss? So maybe a computer that has no data on it, it's lost. Then that would just be a purely monetary loss. But if it's a computer that has customer privacy information that has not been encrypted, then we have a serious loss of information as well as the tangible loss of the asset. Loss consequences may be tangible, that's monetary or industrial casualties, or intangible, things like reputation. They constitute a continuum that spans from partial loss to total loss relative to the asset. Interpretations of the information loss may include, for example, the loss of possession, destruction, or loss of precision or accuracy. And let's talk about those a little bit. Loss of possession. Of course, that someone has stole the device, they've taken it. Destruction, the device or the information has been destroyed. And the first one we can talk about is not just a tangible asset like a system being stolen, but it could be information. We've lost possession of information. And then loss of precision or accuracy. So that's a loss that impacts the accuracy of information. It's been compromised in some way. A loss of function or service may be interpreted as a loss of control, a loss of accessibility, a loss of the ability to deliver normal functions, performance, or behavior, a limited loss of capability resulting in a level of degradation of function, performance, or behavior. So if we lose functionality, that's an impact to the organization as well. Maybe we don't have accessibility to the system. Maybe we can't do the normal functions that the system was designed to do. Maybe the performance or behavior is off. Maybe it's operating very slow, or it's not providing accurate results. Functions are impacted. Physical consequences of compromise can include unscheduled production downtime, industrial equipment damage, casualties at a site, environmental disasters, or public safety threats. So there are physical consequences as well. We have to think about these when we conduct our risk assessment. Prioritization of assets is based on the following by collaborating organizations or by mission or business partners: the asset value, the physical consequences, the cost of replacement, the criticality, the impact on image or reputation, and the trust by users. Those are all evaluated to determine how we prioritize assets and build protections around that. The asset priority translates to precedence in allocating resources, determining minimum strength mechanisms, and defining levels of assurance. So this is when we look at those systems that have a higher prioritization, obviously are going to get more resources allocated to them, so their controls will be stronger, their protective measures will be stronger, their assessments will be more vigorous and more detailed and more in-depth, because those assets are more vital to the organization. Privacy risk assessments are conducted to determine the likelihood that a given operation the system is taking when processing PII could create an adverse effect on individuals and the potential impact on individuals. These adverse effects can arise from uncategorized activities that lead to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability in the information systems processing PII, or may arise as a byproduct of authorized activities. Privacy risk assessments are influenced by contextual factors. So in this, we have to think about privacy or PII information when we're conducting risk assessments. It's important to focus on this type of information in many cases because it may be one of the highest valued assets that exist in the organization, depending on your mission and your function. Adverse effects can arise from unauthorized activities or can be a byproduct of authorized activities. So we have to be cognizant of these activities when we're developing our risk assessment. Contextual factors we talked about in the last slide can include, but are not limited to, the sensitivity level of the PII, including specific elements or in aggregate, the types of organizations using or interacting with the system, and individuals' perceptions about the organizations with respect to privacy, individuals' understanding about the nature and purpose of processing, and the privacy interests of individuals, technological expertise, or demographic characteristics that influence their understanding or behavior. These are the contextual factors we talked about, and they impact the way we will protect PII, and as well as other types of information on the system. This is factored into our risk assessment. Privacy risks to individuals may affect individuals' decisions to engage with the system, thereby impacting the mission or business objectives, or create a legal liability, reputation risks, or other types of risks for the organization. Impacts to the organization are not privacy risks. However, these impacts can guide and inform organizational decision making and influence prioritization and resource allocation for risk response. So we're talking about the impact to individuals, and this is not necessarily a system risk, but we have to think about this in context of the organization. So it may be something we have to factor in. What is the legal liability of an individual piece of PII being released, or an individual when they decide not to engage with the information system because of the possibility of reputational risk? Risk assessments are also conducted to determine the potential that the use of an external provider for different stages, for the development, for the implementation, for the maintenance, management, operation, or disposition of a system element, or a service could create a loss and the potential impact of that loss. So when we decide to work with external providers, we're going to have to conduct risk assessments on those relationships as well. So we may be using contractors or consultants for the development, implementation, maintenance, management, or operation, or even disposition of a system. When we're doing that, we have to factor in that we don't have total control of that third party or that external provider. So we have to make sure that we factor those decisions into our risk assessment. Impact may be immediate, which is something like physical theft, or ongoing, the ability of adversaries to replicate critical equipment because of that theft. And the impact may be endemic, it may be limited only to a single system, or systemic, including any system that uses a specific type of system component. Endemic, maybe that's that one system that's lost, that's one system that's compromised. And systemic, maybe that's every system running Windows 10 is vulnerable to the same impact. So we think about that. It's endemic, it's limited to a single system, or systemic, it's a whole bunch of systems, but they have a thing in common. It's immediate or it's ongoing. Supply chain risk assessments consider vulnerabilities which may arise related to the disposition of a system or system element and from other external providers. Vulnerabilities in supply chain may include the lack of traceability or accountability, leading to potential use of counterfeits, insertions of malware, or poor quality systems. The use of external providers may result in a loss of visibility and control over how systems, system elements, and service are developed, deployed, and maintained. So we think about the different things on this slide. So the vulnerabilities related to disposition of a system. So those vulnerabilities may include the loss of data being released into unauthorized hands. Maybe it's on hard drives of systems that we're having that third-party vendor dispose of for us. We may also be buying our products from a third party, and maybe they're buying a lower quality counterfeit, or maybe they're actually inserting their own malware into it, or they're not very well suited for developing the system. They're building poor quality systems. So we have to think about these. And these are also the case where we have third parties providing us services in developing or deploying or maintaining the systems we have. So we always have to think about not only our employees, we have to do risk assessments on that workforce, but also on the workforce we're looking at a third party for providing, and the systems and devices that both those groups create. Clear understandings of the threats, vulnerabilities, and potential impacts of an adverse supply chain event can help organizations appropriately balance supply chain risk with risk tolerance. Supply chain risk assessments can include information from the supplier's audits or audits of the supplier conducted by a third party, reviews, and supply chain intelligence. I think we have to look at all three of these things when we're looking at a supplier. We shouldn't always go with the lowest priced vendor. We should look at these things as well to make sure we're going with a quality supplier that's going to provide us with secure solutions. Organizations develop a strategy for collecting information, including a strategy for collaborating with providers on supply chain risk assessments. Such collaboration helps organizations leverage information from providers, reduce redundancy, identify potential courses of action for risk response, and reduce the burden on providers. So we want to keep track. We want to collect as much information. And there's a lot of places we can go. Dun & Bradstreet, we can go and find information about specific suppliers. Maybe we can do other research. Maybe we can leverage threat intelligence on different suppliers. There's information collection strategy we should have as an organization, and that should be implemented by the system owner when conducting this task. Risk assessments are conducted throughout the SDLC and support various RMF steps and tasks. Risk assessment results are used to inform security and privacy requirements, definition, and categorization decisions. They help with the selection, tailoring, implementation, and assessment of controls. They help with the authorization decision, potential courses of action and prioritization for risk responses, and they help in the continuous monitoring strategy. So you can see this risk assessment of the supply chain and the SDLC support the RMF throughout its life cycle. So we do these risk assessments on a continual basis. So it shouldn't be once and done. It should be done periodically on a schedule throughout. So we'd want to reassess things as we go along. As we implement the control, we may want to look at things. Did we implement the controls as we planned? Has that changed the risk assessment any? Were there controls we weren't able to implement? That may impact the risk assessment. When the assessor looks at the system, they may determine that the controls were not implemented correctly, and they would have input on the risk assessment as well. And then obviously those authorization decisions are driven by risk assessment results. Organizations determine the form of risk assessment conducted, including the scope, rigor, formality of such assessments, and the method of reporting the results. It's important that we have a standardized method for going about this, and obviously a standardized report format, so different assessments can be looked at together and an overall rating can be determined from different assessments, and we can use that to prioritize systems as well. The scope, rigor, and formality of assessments may vary from system to system. Lower prioritized systems may get a less formal, less rigorous risk assessment than those systems that have a higher priority or a higher impact on the organization. There are a lot of references for this task, including FIPS 199 and 200 and special publications 800-30, 39, 59, 60 volumes 1 and 2, 64, 160 volume 1, 161, IRs 8062 and 8179, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and CNSSI 1253. A ton of reference. You should have access to all of these inside of the course, or you can find them on the internet. In closing, this module we talked about a lot of things. We discussed task P14, its inputs, outputs, roles, responsibility, SDLC and cybersecurity framework alignment. We talked about assessment of risk, impact of asset loss, loss consequences, loss of function, physical consequences, prioritization of assets, contextual factors, privacy risk assessment, privacy risk to individuals, external providers, impact, supply chain risk assessment, information collection strategy, risk assessment, and the SDLC, formatting and reporting, and of course, references. There's a lot of stuff we talked about. This was a larger video than we normally have. So if any of this doesn't look like you understand it fully, if any of these topics look unfamiliar to you, I suggest you go back and watch the video again. But if you get all this stuff, I would say drive on with the course, and we'll see you in the next one.